Thank you for joining us here at CSIS for a discussion of the authorization, new authorization for the use of military force, also known as the AUMF. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by four gentlemen from the United States Congress who have worked together, banded together to sponsor a particular piece of legislation in this debate over AUMF. And so we wanted to take the opportunity to bring them together to talk about what brought them to introducing this legislation and a broader conversation about Congress's role in the authorization of force. Before we begin, just a reminder that we have exits at the back of the room should a fire alarm go off, and I'll direct you in that case. And then I want to also introduce each of our panelists before we get into the conversation. So beginning on my left, we have Representative Don Bacon. He was elected to Congress in 2016 and represents Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District. Representative Bacon served in the Air Force for nearly 30 years and retired as a brigadier general. For his outstanding service, he has been awarded the Air Force Distinguished Service Medal, 2 Bronze Stars, 2 Legions of Merit, 5 Meritorious Service Medals, the Aerial Achievement Medal. I think I've got them all, or at least all the big ones.
Much.
He was selected as Europe's top Air Force Wing Commander and recognized as a distinguished graduate of the Air Command and Staff College. He currently serves on the House Armed Services Committee, House Homeland Security Committee, and House Agricultural Committee. To my direct right, we have Representative Ruben Gallego, who was elected to Congress in 2014 and represents Arizona's 7th District. He serves as a senior whip for the Democratic Caucus, the 2nd Vice Chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Vice Chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and Vice Chair of the Equality Caucus. You are very busy. He currently sits on the House Armed Services Committee and the Natural Resources Committee. To his immediate right is Representative Mike Kaufman, who was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2008 and represents Colorado's 6th Congressional District. He has served in both the U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps. He's the only member of Congress to have served in both Iraq wars. Representative Coffman serves on the Veterans Affairs Committee and the Armed Services Committee, where he is the chairman for the Subcommittee on Military Personnel. And all the way to the right today, which you probably don't get to be called often, is Representative Jimmy Panetta, who was elected to Congress in 2016 and serves as the representative to California's 20th Congressional District. He served in Afghanistan as a part of Operation Enduring Freedom, where he worked with Special Forces units and, as a result of his outstanding service, was awarded the Bronze Star. He has spent considerable time working with military veterans and is a member of the House Armed Services Committee and House Agricultural Committee. So, gentlemen, obviously very distinguished careers in the Congress. Also, obviously, all veterans, so you have a very particular perspective, I think, to bring to this conversation today. And if I can begin with you, Representative Bacon, and then maybe turn to my right to the others, just get you to talk a little bit about what brought you to sponsoring this legislation and what are you hoping to see out of Congress on this issue of AUMF?
Well, I think our Article 1 responsibilities are very important. And I think the fact that we voted on the authorization to use force 16 years ago, and that's what we're using now, in fact, and we've used that authorization to allow force to be used in 14 different countries. And I think when you look back, only about 25% of Congress that's currently in Congress voted on this authorization. I'm troubled by that. I don't think this authorization to use force should be a blank check. And I think that's what it's become. And I support our operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, but I think if we vote on something 16 years earlier and we're still using that authorization, that there's something not right. And I think we owe it to the servicemen and women to show that Congress supports or doesn't support, but we should put our names on the line saying that we support these operations, if indeed we do. And I think our servicemen and women deserve that. So to me, it comes down to our Article 1 responsibilities. I think we're not living up to it, waiting 16 years.
That's Gallego.
Well, for me, I mean, partly is personal experience. Like being on the enlisted side, I served with a lot of young men. I was in the infantry and the Marines, and some of the youngest men I served with were 17, 18. And next year, there will be somebody, male or female, that is going to be serving in Afghanistan that was not alive when 9/11 happened. So we need to be looking at our AUMF status. where it is being used, how it is being used. We do need to rein in the executive. We should have reined it in before Donald Trump. Now more so than ever, we should rein it in now. I think a 5-year AUMF is a very good compromise because this is not just solely about Donald Trump. Had we just done this right now, then I think it becomes an extremely partisan issue. But it does require, especially Congress, to take back its responsibilities, especially when waging war. And this is a good compromise that I think allows, effectively the execution of what is going on right now, while at the same time brings some level of accountability to these wars. And the more that we keep on spreading out from Iraq and Afghanistan, Syria, now we're operating in Niger, we're going to have a lot more of these conversations, although that wasn't necessarily under the AUMF action. But you're going to see this, and we need to start talking to our constituents about why there are troops in some areas, why are some of our military personnel dying in places that you have not heard of, and why we haven't actually, authorized any of this.
Representative Coffman.
Well, I'm very concerned. I got involved in this issue because I'm so concerned about the erosion of the balance of power between the executive and the legislative branch, Article 1, Article 2 of the Constitution. There's no question, I think, that the existing authorizations for use of military force are, in my view, very outdated. But the Congress should. I think one thing I like about this AUMF is the fact that expires in 5 years, and it requires the Congress of the United States to debate again, as opposed to having an executive branch continue to extrapolate off an existing AUMF. So I like the fact that it forces a debate. In particular, I was very concerned. I was elected in 2008, started in 2009. In 2011, the prior administration intervened in Libya and never went to the Congress of the United States for an authorization of use of military force. And I think we should have had that debate, because I believe that had we had the debate, we would not have gone into Libya. And our actions, I believe, destabilized not just Libya, but that region. And so there is value to that debate. There's a value to the checks and balances in this balance of power. And if we allow the existing AUMFs to stand without ever challenging them in terms of reauthorizing a new one and repealing them, I think we are allowing this precedent of the imperial presidency and that continued erosion of power.
Thank you, Representative Panetta.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen, and thanks to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and thanks to my fellow peers and Congress members up here as well. Look, I think it comes down to, renew, reassert, and resolve. We need to refurbish this current AUMF. There's no doubt about that. I mean, there's been a lot of distance, as it's been said, a lot of distance between the text that was written in 2001 to the mini combat operations that we have up to this day. And therefore, you have groups that are being targeted today that weren't even around back in 2001. And so it needs to be refurbished. We need, as Congress members, we need to reassert our authority. We need, under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, basically get back to living up to our responsibilities and our ability to declare war. And that's what I think is you're going to hear a constant theme about here. We need to basically, like I said, take that control back and stop ceding it to the president. And we understand and basically let other people know that this, Section 1 gives Congress that power. And we need to continue to show our resolve. Obviously, as Congress members, we represent the people, and we need to let our troops know that there is a resolve there. That we support them. We need to let our troops know. We need to let our allies know this. And obviously, most importantly, we need to let our enemies know that it's the U.S. Congress and the people of the United States that has a resolve to carry out this fight.
Representative Kaufman, you are the longest serving of the members on the panel. You've been in Congress since 2008. I wonder if you could help us reflect on from your perspective on how this debate has grown or evolved in the intervening last roughly 10 years, and why is now the time that Congress is leaning very far forward on this issue of AUMF?
Well, I think certainly the Niger issue was mentioned, but I think even prior to that, when we're involved in Syria, when we're extrapolating from Al-Qaeda into other organizations, and that the environment, the threat scenarios are very different today, I think, than they were back in the aftermath of 9/11. And so, but I think, irrespective of it, I think again what I like is this notion that that we're going to repeal the existing ones and have a new one, and that new one will expire in 5 years, and force the Congress of the United States into debate again. I think this is very important.
No, and you mentioned the same, Representative Gallego, that the sunset clause, this 5-year window, if you will, after which it would have to be reauthorized, is important to you. Do you have the same thoughts in your mind?
Well, I mean, I think it's a more responsible way that I've seen the AUMF introduced. There have been other AUMF bills introduced into Congress, but some of them are, I would say, somewhat irresponsible. They cut off authorization use of military force, the 2001 authorization, right away. I think that is not the responsible way to do this. I think that would not only be wholly responsible to our troops overseas, but also I think it would toss this issue into a totally political argument in Congress, because we'd have to turn around quickly and try to figure out, how to whether to authorize it again or not. This at least gives us the time frame to actually think about it as Congress. It gives the executive the time frame to think about it. And part of also this bill is that there's also a 90-day requirement where the Department of Defense has to come and actually report to Congress about their actions under the AUMF, which is something that also needs to be done because we're not getting as many updates and reports from the Department of Defense all the time. So I think this bill is a good evolution from what has been naturally occurring. Both Democrats and Republicans at one point or other have introduced different AUMF bills, but this is a good compromise bill that takes into the reality of what we're dealing with right now, both on the domestic political side as well as our requirements overseas.
One big issue, Representative Bacon, in debates over AUMF tend to be this tension between maximizing operational flexibility to those down range and having appropriate oversight as provided for under Article 1, the portion of the U.S. Constitution that deals with the legislative branch. How do you think, having served, as all of you have, how do you think about now as a member of Congress resolving this tension in a way that provides sufficient flexibility but also appropriate oversight?
Well, thank you. I think we've lost that balance now. When you go 16 years since the last authorization, and literally 75% of Congress that's there now have never voted on it, that's way too much to the one side. And I think, as our colleagues here have mentioned, that I think this 5-year renewal does provide that balance. We do want to get some rein or some leash to the executive to fight this war and to win it. So we don't want to overcorrect as well. So I think there's a balance here with the 5-year, and you know what? It forces Congress. I think Jimmy or Congressman Panetta mentioned this, the resolve part. We represent the will of the people, and I think it's important to make that statement periodically, saying we support these operations, if indeed we do. It's important for our servicemen and women to know that, and for our adversaries and our allies, and to go 16 years, I think there's a problem. It's a blank check, and that's not what we were designed to do.
Mm-hmm. I imagine all of you have heard quite a bit from your constituents on a wide range of issues, but not least of which is how our foreign policy and our military's use as an instrument of it has been experienced by them. Maybe starting with Congressman Panetta, just welcome your thoughts on what you hear primarily from your constituency with regard to these issues of use of military force, whether it's in Afghanistan or, as has been discussed before, places like Niger where people may not have even realized we were operating.
Of course, of course. Yeah, I mean, you get, first of all, I have a very diverse district when it comes to not just geography, but obviously socioeconomics and the types of people that are in the central coast of California. So I hear all types, okay? But those concerns stem, from anything of, why are we in those places? What gives us the authority to be in those places? Why are we still doing this? Yeah, that's right, we better, protect our home front and basically take it to them. And that's why I think we must revisit this authorization to use of military force. And I believe that our bill does that. And so that's what I explained to them when this comes up, and talking about there is, as you mentioned, there is oversight on what we're doing. This bill, I think, is basically the right way to do it because it talks about the purpose and the authority. It talks about the targets, who exactly we're targeting. It talks about a sunset clause. It talks about the reporting within the first 60 days and then every 90 days thereafter, and it repeals the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs that are already there. So when you explain that to them, it gives them a little bit of reassurance that Congress is actually playing a part. They want us to play a part. They don't just want to leave it up to the executive branch. They want to be a part of that, and I feel as a representative of those people, that's our job. And that's why it's great that we can at least put this forward, the four of us can put this forward and hopefully move this onto the House floor.
Congressman Kaufman, I would welcome your thoughts, obviously, on the constituent feedback, but in particular this issue of the scope of the target, if you will, the associated forces. The 2001, 2002, 2001 AUMF is targeted at al-Qaeda, doesn't cover, at least by name, certainly the Islamic State. And here we are many years later, al-Qaeda is still present, but we have these other groups, not least of which is the Islamic State. What's your sense of the appropriate scope of your AUMF with regard to the types of entities that ought to be targeted under it?
Well, I think that the challenge in this counterterrorism environment that we're in is that in effect, I think what al-Qaeda started, and there are some predecessor organizations were to al-Qaeda, but was in fact an ideology, if you will. And so there are franchises of it. And so we do have to make sure that we rationally capture that ability to metastasize, but without going too far, and I think we strike the right balance here.
Do you all, remind me, are nation states entities excluded or included?
Nation state entities are excluded.
Okay, so for instance, government of Syria attack on something like that.
Correct. Government of Syria, Iran, under this AUMF would not authorize that. That would have to be a separate action, and hopefully at that point, that's an action where Congress actually declares war.
I think you raised, sort of touched on a good point. 14 countries have been targeted using the first authorization, going for 16 years. And I think that's all right but if we should have done it in 5-year increments to have these debates. And I get feedback all the time. Why are we still there? That's important for Congress to debate. I think there's a good reason to be there. We cannot let the Taliban win, but if we don't have that debate, then I don't think our constituents feel like they're being informed on it. And we should have that discussion. And I think we should have buy-in from our citizens, and that's through Congress. And I think it's very important to have that discussion because people are giving their lives and they're coming back injured. And I think we're needed to be there, but to never to have that discussion in Congress or to wait this long, I don't think it's healthy. And I think our citizens are asking for this discussion and want to be reassured that it's the right thing to do.
There certainly has been, especially now the conversation around tax cuts and deficits. I have heard a lot of conversations with my constituents, and they don't really understand AUMF. They don't actually get into the intricacies of this type of stuff, but they do know that we're in a lot of places, we're expending a lot of money, and then we're doing tax cuts at the same time, and then we're complaining about deficits at the same time. And all they know is that we've been in an unending war, and we're just going to continue being an unending war. And it's going to cost more lives and more out of our treasury, and yet there is no check or balance to it whatsoever. And people, I think there's a natural tendency in democracies for people to start feeling that there's something wrong. And it's also, in my opinion, it's not good for the soul of a democracy to be in war this long. We've been in these wars longer now than we have in Vietnam, and at some point, I think that starts affecting subconsciously a lot of voters and a lot of constituents' minds, and they start talking to us in whatever way they can. But I think they're saying that it's time to rein this in.
So can we get, and I'll get to, well, we can start with you actually. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to, back to your first question in
Yeah.
regards to, who it's, as you said, targeting.
Right.
And just let me read directly from the text, and it may stir some questions when it comes to that time. But what it says is, for purposes of Section 3A3, the term associated persons or forces means any person or force other than the sovereign nation that, one, is part of or substantially supports Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and two, is engaged in hostilities against the United States, its armed forces, or its other personnel. So that's it right there. So we lay it out, and when you say that to your constituents, it basically lets them know that it's defined, and it's targeted, and it's narrowed down. And I think that's important to them.
Did you want to add something?
Well, I think that it's just so important, I think, again, for Congress to assert itself. I fought leadership, Republican and Democrat, again back in 2011 when the administration went into Libya with only consulting leadership on both sides of the aisle, but not requiring a vote.
Right.
And I think that was, and I think when you do that, when you allow that to occur, you're just yielding your responsibilities to the administrative, to the executive branch, which again has been building up over time, and so we've got to reset, and I think this is part of it.
So what comes through very much in this conversation, of course, is that there's this principled issue of the role of Congress, but there's also a policy issue, which in particular Representative Gallego's comments were starting to get at, but it's come through in everything we've heard here, which is what should be the U.S. counterterrorism strategy, and how should we think about how expansive that is and the role of U.S. military force as part of that. And I just wonder if you would each like to comment, maybe I'll start with you since you raised it, and we'll kind of loop around, with what you think that ought to be. Are we on the right path? Are we undertaking the right set of initiatives? Are we off balance? What's your net assessment?
I mean, my net assessment is that our coin strategy around the world is just pretty much failing. I mean, the best coin success we actually have had is in Colombia, and that was a really good approach that we used, which was a combination of military force, local trainees, and a whole government approach. And I think that's where we are lacking in the Middle East. We are playing whack-a-mole many times, and I saw this in Iraq, where we'd go into an area, clear out the insurgents, we'd leave, insurgents would come back. There was no backfill. There was no local police force that would come in. There was no local government force that would come in, give jobs, give training, give a reason for these people not to be joining with the insurgents. And what you're seeing all around the country, especially in the Middle East, is you have different stages of insurgency. You have the full-blown insurgency that you had, or terrorism you had with ISIS, where they nearly became a nation state. And then you have destabilizing elements that are operating all over the Middle East, like, for example, what you see in Sinai. So we have to, one, be flexible. And for example, like in Egypt, what we should do is train the Egyptians, which is one of the largest armies in the world, to actually know how to go and operate and take out people in the Sinai. In places like Iraq, we should work with the government to root out corruption, root out sectarianism within its government, make sure they create an actual government that gives the Sunni an avenue for them to feel like an actual nation. And we could do that not necessarily just with troops, but with actually fully putting in the effort of USAID, the State Department, and other NGOs that could go there and truly reform a country like that, and into other places where, again, you have really low-level insurgency starting to move. For example, in the Central or East Africa corridor, work with our snake eaters to to train the local forces to put down and stop these local insurgency or affiliates, usually of ISIS, that are just barely starting out before they get the momentum and the movement and the backing from the local villagers and local, just locals in general, before they can get that momentum to actually become dangerous and an existential threat to that nation state.
Congressman Aiken.
Well, again, we've been doing this for 16 years, and we need to have this discussion in Congress because it represents the concerns of our constituents, and that's why it's so important to do this and to have this in a recurring 5-year increment at least. I think generally I support what we're doing in Afghanistan. I think we found the right balance with our policy right now. So I think we should be there, but we should commit to that in Congress and affirm that, I believe. I think what we've done in Iraq and Syria has been positive, but we're leaving a vacuum right now for the Iranians to fill, which is troublesome. I don't think we have a strategy right now to figure out how to counter the Quds force or the Iranian influence in Syria and Iraq, and it's going to present a problem down the road that we're going to have to deal with again in a different way. I think we do a pretty good job doing kinetics, we call it, taking the military actions against these terrorists. I think we're doing better now going after finances, though we have to have a more concerted effort. We're going into the internet more to try to undermine the recruiting of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other groups. I think, but that we could do more of. There was a period of time where ISIS were bringing about 30 to 50 people a month from all over the world, and they were joining, as foreign fighters in this fight. So we have to work and undermine that. The one thing I don't think we do well is how do we undermine the ideology that recruits folks from all over this world, whether into the ISIS itself or as a lone wolf, a terrorist. And that's a hard thing for our country to figure out how to handle. But we need to have overseas a way to go after the ideology. And I think we have to work with our moderate Islamic friends like Jordan and other countries to figure out how to take away that incentive or the desire to join these forces. But how do we even do it in our own country? And that's an area that we have not figured out, but we have to be willing to have this discussion because that's the root cause. And if we don't get to the root cause of Islamic extremism, we're going to be fighting this for decades. And so I think that's an area that we have to go into. And I've not heard a good way forward yet on the ideology part.
I can think back as far as 2004, right? I was talking about the war of ideas, and here we are in
I brought it up when I was there in 2007 and 8.
Yeah.
And I said, we need to find a way to bring in moderate Islamic folks in Iraq. That's when I served a year in Baghdad at that point. And they said, Don, just let that go. We don't know how to do that. And I think, but that's the root cause.
Yeah. Congressman, and then we'll go to Congressman Panetta.
Well, I think we're learning the hard way. We continue to learn the hard way. I think if you look back in the Bush administration after 9/11, when we look at these authorizations, initially it was about counterinsurgency. It was about nation building, with the assumption somehow that they really wanted to be like us, and if only given the opportunity, they would be like us. I think it's very culturally naive, and I think we're more realistic now. So we've migrated to more from counterinsurgency to counterterrorism, but you can't go all the way over there. I think there's an element where, if you look at Iraq, that in the ISIS spilling over to take all the Sunni Arab areas that were disaffected from the Shia-dominated central government, that we need to put pressure on that government to be more pluralistic in its governance, and because otherwise it's just going to happen again, and we're going to be involved in there again. But we have to. I think we have to strike the right balance, and that's really hard to do, particularly in Afghanistan where we're so far into it. Should we have ever gotten into it in the first place? I don't think so. I mean, I think the Bush administration policy initially was brilliant. We gave air advisory and logistical support to the anti-Taliban forces, the Northern Alliance, that gave safe harbor to Al-Qaeda. But then after they won on the ground, we pushed them aside and superimposed a political system that we wanted them to have that doesn't quite fit the country. And so, but we're having to wrestle through that now. We can't just extricate ourselves from it overnight.
The bill that we've put forward only deals with a very small part of this large strategy, in the prevention of any future acts of international terrorism against the United States. But unfortunately, we have yet to see what that strategy is from our administration. They were supposed to put forward a national security strategy within the first, 150 days, 180 days. We haven't seen anything, not even sniffed that out. And so we need to, that's why I think something like this, starting off and talking about something that's so important in this type of preventing any further international terrorist attacks against the United States, is a discussion that needs to be had. It's kind of a ground level discussion. And so that's why it's important that we're putting forward this bill. That's why it's important that Congress needs to get involved and continue to have these discussions, because we need to fill that void, not only in our government, but obviously abroad. And because if we don't fill that void, if we don't lead, we may see other entities, other countries that do, as we are seeing, and it may not align with the values that we stand for and that we're fighting for right now.
I'm going to ask one final question for all of you and then open it up to the audience for some of their questions. So maybe we'll just come right back down the line, starting with Congressman Panetta. You all occupy a very unique place. You're veterans serving inside the Article 1 element of our constitutional civilian system of governance. And civil-military relations is something that's part and parcel of the responsibility of our government. I would love to get your thoughts on the state of civil-military relations and how your bill, you think, can help, assuming all of you believe that, a bill can help advance that.
Yeah. And look, I think the fact that you're seeing the four of us up here, Democrats and Republicans, supporting this type of bill stems from our backgrounds, in the sense that we understand what it means to serve a higher entity than ourselves, than party, and it's about serving our country. And so that's why it's important that we continue to have, I believe, it helps when you have veterans in Congress and serving in this role that it combines our civilian experience and our military experience. And I think it's important that we understand, obviously, what troops on the ground go through, but we also understand what it means to have a mission, go after it, and get it done. And look, party politics, it can be difficult sometimes getting past party politics. Party leadership may not want us to work across the aisle, but the fact is we understand what it takes to do that based on our military experience, and I've seen that more and more, especially with men and women who I serve with in Congress, that are willing to do that, step outside that party politics and step into the basically the front lines of getting things done for our country. So I mean, like I said, this is just a small sample of what I'm seeing in Congress, in the sense where you see people who have served are willing to serve their country, and basically across all lines.
Great.
I think it's very important as well to have veterans serving in the Congress of the United States that have had experience, but I just think it's so important to have the debate. Whenever this country is going to go to war or commit military forces into harm's way, that there be that debate in the Congress of the United States, because it involves the American people, because the members of Congress in the House, in our case, will have to go back to their districts and justify their vote, and probably hold town hall meetings throughout their congressional districts to hear from citizens directly as to whether they think this particular clause is worthwhile. And I just think that that's absolutely so critical, and that at the end of the day, the American people will either buy into it or they won't buy into it.
I think we need to reassert our authority as civilians over the military. There's been this slide where somehow we're not allowed to question generals, question what's going on in the military. It is going to this level of militarism that I don't think this country has ever intended. And it's good that we have members of Congress that were in the military, that are in the armed services, but it's more important that they're on there and they're keeping Department of Defense and the military in check, as well as the executive, which is involved in this too. because I've seen this tendency, and I really dislike it, where if someone comes in and they're a general and they say some really fancy words, I see a lot of heads, both Democrats and Republicans, that just start nodding, and they don't start questioning.
Using fancy words,
yeah.
by the way.
Not this general. But we are oversight. We are there to keep the Department of Defense accountable, and we also need to make sure that the civilian world understands that this is civilian-led military. It always has been. We have a right to question our generals. We have a right to question the executive. We have a right to question whether we should be at war or not. And this kind of jingoistic kind of militaristic tendency that this country is going to is very detrimental to democracy, and we need to be pushing back on it at every level possible.
General.
No fancy words here. A couple things come to mind. First, in the 1970s, I think it was 1977, almost 80% of our Congress were veterans. And now it's gone down to about, it was 17% last Congress, and for the first time since the late 70s, it's gone up by 1 or 2 points. We have a lot of new veterans that came in the freshman class. And I surely don't think everybody has to be a veteran, but it's important to have that some of that influence in Congress, because I've been to people's homes, knocking on their door, talking about the loss of their son or daughter. And I think we need to have some of that experience in Congress that knows the cost of war firsthand. So I think that's important to have some of that influence in Congress. And I've been seeing a little different trend than I think what Congressman Gallego was talking about. I'm seeing a growing trend of isolationism. And if we go 16 years between votes on authorization and we're supporting the war nonstop, there is that, well, why are we even there? And we should have that debate, but we're not having that debate. And I think there's good reasons why we're there. We can't let the Taliban take Afghanistan over, because they will export terror here again. Some people may disagree with that, but it's good to have that debate and to vote on it, and I think that's how you get more support from our constituents. And I would just say maybe one other thing to your question. 1% of our nation serves right now, and if you look at our veterans, that's roughly 7% of our population are veterans. A lot of our people who serve today, their fathers served or their mothers served, so it's a generational being passed on. So we're seeing a very small group of our country and folks who understand or have been to war. And I think, again, if we don't have these debates or talk about Congress, we're doing a disservice to that, because the war's fallen on a few shoulders out there. And so I think part of the civil-military relations is to have this debate and discussion, because this is a shared endeavor, but it doesn't feel shared when we never have the debate, and only very few people are fighting it.
Very good. Okay, I think we've given you a lot to comment on. There is a microphone. When I call you, I'd like you to stand, give your name and your affiliation. A question ends in a question mark and not a paragraph. So we'll start right here.
Hi, thank you for this event. Rachel Oswald, Congressional Quarterly. 2 questions. How does your bill significantly differ from the Flake Cane AUMF that is being considered by Foreign Relations? And secondly, you are all HASC members, but House Foreign Affairs has the oversight on this. How have conversations been with the committee? Is Chairman Royce receptive? Do you see any activity happening on that in the near future? Thank you.
Well, I forgot, I don't need a mic. On a separate note, actually, Representative Bradley Byrne from Alabama and I actually introduced a bill to actually bring AUMF authority back and jurisdiction over to House Armed Services Committee. Now, does the Foreign Affairs Committee like that? I don't know, but
You have to get through that committee first.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but look, if we're going to wage war, if the Armed Services Committee is going to, fund a war, going to hold people for accountability, has a level of expertise, then it should be the House Armed Services Committee that actually has a jurisdiction when it comes to AUMF. Now, our bill, as introduced right now, because power of jurisdiction still would go through, obviously, the Foreign Affairs Committee, would still go through that. But the fact that it's significant that for our members of the Armed Services Committee, bipartisan, veterans are doing it, is more of a larger statement about how serious we are about this. And I don't actually know the details on the Cane Flake bill.
Anyone down here? Looks like Congressman Panetta has his book open.
The one difference, they are pretty similar. The Senate bill is a little more extensive, and the one area that they address specifically is geography. When they talk about it in Section 5, countries in which operations are authorized. And so we go by country, it's more about organizations, and rather than limit it to that.
My sense is there's not a lot of support, or there's not enough support to get this through the House right now, but that's why we're doing this, because we need to generate that and grow the support. I think many members would rather not take a vote. They can pat themselves on the back for when we're doing well and criticize when we're doing poorly. And I think it's important to put our names on the line and take responsibility and be accountable to our constituents on this. And so I think our job is to grow that support, and I hope this is a good forum to help do that.
Great. Okay, we have a question right here on the end.
Terrific to see the veterans. I was a long time ago a scout platoon in Desert Storm, then served with California Army National Guard in Salinas. 2 questions. If this bill were in place and the Syrian government used chemical weapons again, how would it influence authorization for the president to make a strike as President Trump did? First question. Second question, you mentioned about the reporting. I don't think any of our smart generals or admirals since General Shinseki, when they presented to Congress, they have said what General Shinseki said, no, we would need more troops. The situations we've had with the 7th Fleet show that evidently generals and admirals have felt like they don't have the resources they need to safely do their mission, but perhaps they haven't had the intestinal fortitude to tell Congress about that. How can we encourage more candor in that area from our admirals and generals? Thank you.
Okay, so let's take the first piece of that, which is how would it change an authorization against a Syrian action?
Well, I mean, as Syria is still considered a sovereign nation, under our AUMF that replaces the old AUMF, we would not have the authority under that to attack Syria because of their use of chemical actions. Now, the president obviously has other authorities that he could use, but then that would, again, require, in our opinion, for some explanation to Congress. Right. But this would not allow us to do the other. So at least I'll take that portion of the first question.
Anyone else want to comment?
Well, I think the administration assessed that Syria was in violation of a chemical weapons treaty, and that it was a time-sensitive measure to react. If it were clearly anything that were ongoing, they would have to come back to the Congress of the United States for authorization, because this does not give them authorization.
Exactly what the War Powers Resolution of 73. That's what they would continue to act on, imagine.
Okay, and the second question in there was, I'm sorry, now I'm remembering.
It's about a strategy that demands a lot, but we're not funding to that level.
Yes, sorry, yes. What is your sense about the relative reticence or willingness of senior military to speak truth to power, if you will, with regard to needs in your experience as members of HASC?
I think they have, actually. We hear in the HASC all the time that the strategy's way up here, but your funding is here, mainly because of sequester, 22% reduction from the 2010 budget to where we were at last year. We put in 4% last year, so now it's an 18% reduction. We've had 31 CRs. The Chief of Staff of the Army came in and said, if you do another CR, that is professional malpractice to Congress. And that's just one example of many that we've heard from our generals. I think they've been very clear that Congress has been failing our men and women in uniform. And we are doing a strategy that's up here, but funding somewhere down here, and it's not fair to the sailors in the 7th Fleet or folks that are flying that don't have the training that we used to give them. In the 90s when I was a captain, compared to what the captains are flying today, I used to fly almost double, so maybe triple in some of the units versus what they're flying today, and it's not right. So I think we've been hearing pretty loud and clear from our generals that there is a problem, but yet we're saying do it anyway, and I think it's unacceptable.
Yeah, just to kind of cover that, we hear it all the time. They're being very honest. The problem is that, like, we in Congress, and I think Americans in general, need to make a decision. Mm-hmm. You can't have the best military in the world and at the same time keep cutting taxes. You just can't do it, right? You want to be able to be all over the world, have the top military, oh, and by the way, take care of them afterwards, then pay for it, right? Because right now, we're trying to do everything on the cheap, and then we end up getting cheap results. And then we're surprised by this, right? So we need to have a conversation as a nation what we actually want. Because this is not working anymore. It's going to continue to degrade. We're going to have, these tax cuts are going to cause another huge deficit. We're going to go back and try to find money again by cutting more. So we're going to end up cutting probably into social programs at some point. And then at some point, then we have to, again, look at the defense budget. It's one of the few discretionary areas that we actually have. And then again, we're going to have a conversation years from now, like, wow, why are we having all these mishaps? Why isn't our military where we are? And I guarantee you we're going to have another discussion about tax cuts again. At some point, you have to decide where you want to go as a nation. Like, this is not sustainable in the long run.
I think we have to challenge the Department of Defense a lot more in terms of their spending. They're so wedded to their culture that they're reluctant to change, and Congress is reluctant to force them to change. I'll give you an example. When we look at the relationship between the Guard and Reserve and the active duty, that other countries that rely much more heavily on their Guard and Reserve than we do. Israel, I think, probably on the ground component, is probably about a 1-to-7 ratio or more between their active duty and their reserve component. We're a 1-to-1, and that is very expensive to maintain. And so that we've got to challenge them more, and we have to come up with better ideas in terms of things like force structure, better at acquisition to make those defense dollars go further in terms of protecting this country. I think every dollar wasted by the Department of Defense is a dollar not spent defending this country.
Yeah.
Congressman Panetta, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, once again, it gets back to this is the first step of what we're talking about today with this AUMF and trying to get that debate out on the floor of Congress. And so that people can basically have a frank discussion about what's going on. I was fortunate enough in August to visit the Horn of Africa and go out to where our special forces are training the trainers and doing things of that nature. And when I served with Special Forces as an intelligence officer, let me make that clear, as an intelligence officer with Special Forces in '08, we had the resources necessary to take that fight in Afghanistan, to take the fight to the enemy in Afghanistan. But what I heard from the Special Forces in Africa is, there needs to be, they need to be focused on. We are working them day after day after day. It's becoming a situation where it can get dangerous for them. And so we are hearing that, not just in our committee, but there are members, plenty of members have gone out into other countries where they're serving and heard from forces and boots on the ground there that have basically told us, no, we need the resources.
Okay, let's take a question here, and I failed in my moderating by not saying one question each, please. So one question each, right here.
Hi, I'm Susan from the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Many advocates who are working on this issue had many concerns with the 2001 AUMF, such as no geographic limitation, no sunset, no clarity on detention at Guantanamo Bay, or definition of associated forces or persons. Can you walk me through your thought process as what you wanted to address in this bill and what you did not out of those elements?
Okay, so the elements, just to review, were sunset clause, geographic scope, and I think in particular that you haven't addressed yet, detainee issues.
Well, the most important thing in terms of the element of this is to get it passed. Because if you actually don't get it passed, then you actually have this situation actually keep going, which is even worse, the worst situation of all, which is a war or an AUMF that is so liberal that it is being used in almost every context where possible. So there's some elements we did not address because once we get down that road, we start losing votes, right? And if you want to actually have some opportunity to rein in the executive and be able to, have the DOD be held accountable by Congress, you need to first get a bill that passes, right? So as much as I hate Guantanamo and its use, and I think it is a horrible use and should have been ended by Obama, it should never have been started in the first place. The reason it wasn't, I did include it in this is because this bill would never have gotten off the ground. It would have been more difficult for me, I think, for it to be bipartisan. And I think it would have been very difficult in general for it to even see the light of day. So that's why some of these elements are mentioned. Now, there are fail-safes in this where we require Congress to come, we require the Department of Defense to come and report to us. It's not that they're just going to be able to say anything to associated force under our AUMF. They're going to have to come and talk to us the first 60 days initially, and then 90 days afterwards. So that allows, I think, again, more of a check and balance for Congress, so that way there's not a liberal use of the term associated forces. But again, the choice is either the reality, which is what we have right now, which is a very, very loose use of the AUMF, versus actually trying to rein something in and do it in a bipartisan manner. And I think that's why you see some elements of the AUMF that I think people would like to see, especially progressive people like myself, that just aren't in there. Because pragmatically speaking, this bill would never even get off the ground if that was the case.
Okay,
No.
you do. Let's take one final question, and I have one. Let me see here, right over here.
Peter Pennington, one-time Royal Navy. What would the consequences be, political and military, if Congress finds it can't sign off on a particular campaign?
Well, maybe this helps to explain how it works, maybe to walk through that.
Sure. If, let's say, it could happen in two ways. Number one, the administration initiated a military action not defined in the current AUMF, or they went to the Congress first because it was not time sensitive, so time sensitive to be able to do a military intervention such as Libya. If in fact, in the first instance, that Congress could in fact vote against that and would force a withdrawal. And I think if we go to the War Powers Act of '73, which has never been vetted, I think, constitutionally, I think it gives the administration, I think, first there are 60 days in which to come to the Congress, and if Congress does not authorize, then 30 days to withdraw forces. And so that is the power that the Congress of the United States has that needs to exercise.
First, I'd like to say I've enjoyed working with our British friends all over the world, great allies, and we're grateful. And I think I interpret your question, what happens if we don't approve or don't authorize force? Well, then we shouldn't be there. We represent our districts, the will of the people, and if there's not that support in our country for combat operations in a certain place, well, then we should withdraw. But I think we should be there, and we should have that debate. But if we don't have that debate either, I don't think we grow that support. And as I mentioned earlier, I see a trend towards isolationism in a lot of areas because we're not talking about it. So, but in the end, it's our Article 1 responsibility to authorize force. And if we can't do that, then we shouldn't be there.
The consequence is that our democracy works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's it.
Any final thoughts before we close out here? Anything we didn't touch on, or something you want to foot stomp?
Again, and this is a conversation I've had with a lot of people on the, more progressive to liberal spectrum about this bill. This is an actual compromise. We can try to pass a bill, or I could try to put a bill together, and Mr. Kaufman or anyone here could try to put a bill together that would make a good messaging piece. But in the end, if nothing happens, nothing changes, this AUMF still stays. And it will stay basically in perpetuity. And that cannot last. So, for both sides, looking at a way to actually rein in the executive, rein in the DOD is really, really important. And the first step is not the last step either. Once we get something like this going, once we actually are able to pass this, it doesn't mean, I think what it will do is it will reinvigorate the relationship that Congress has with the executive in terms of keeping them in check when it comes to waging war. And I think it'll expand into other areas, not just within the AUMF.
I think what is so extraordinary about this are two things. Number one, the fact that we have 4 combat veterans who put this forward. And number two, that it is bipartisan with 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And so at two levels. I think it's extraordinary that we've come together to put this forward.
My closing comment would be, I don't think we intended the 2001 authorization to be a blank check, and that's what it's become. 14 different countries we've operated in with this authorization. And I think it's time that Congress show accountability, responsibility, and step forward and say, yes, we want to continue these operations or not. And I think that's important for our Article 1 responsibilities. I think it's good for democracy and a republic form of government.
Yeah. And I'll just close with the same thing I started with. It needs to be renewed. We have to show our resolve, and we have to reassert our authority.
Well, Congressman, so much time is spent on bemoaning what isn't working in Washington. I'm so happy that we had an opportunity to see something that is working, which is this bipartisan effort to move some legislation forward. So please join me in thanking the members for their time.
Thank you. Thanks.